All right, Professor Barry here. Good morning, good afternoon. Hope everything's going well for you, that you're getting started really well with this class as well as other classes. If you ever have any questions, I'm here to help to support you in any way that I can. Last week we kind of got it started into, what is sociology, trying to pull apart the micro level, the macro level, the combining them, like the sociological imagination, the private troubles, public issues, right? These are integrated. Stepping back to take a beginner's mind, we get immersed within culture, which is our topic for this particular week, is exploring culture. But sometimes we're swimming in the water and we don't recognize the uniqueness that we're actually in water. I mean, culture is ever present, but yet it's invisible to us. Made that connection in the first week's kind of lecture about white privilege, thinking about something that we all have a racial identity. Members of the dominant group have a racial identity, although it may be invisible, may be very difficult to see, be difficult to recognize, but it doesn't mean it's not there. So take a beginner's mind, step back, try to understand. And sometimes it's very difficult to do, especially if we have very strong convictions about something. And I think that the strength of those convictions, if we haven't arrived at those convictions through systematic and detailed understanding and examination, I think it gets really challenging because we have, in the one sense, it's very, we're trying to develop critical thinking skills, to be able to approach things more objectively, to understand things more systematically, to use evidence and research to drive decision-making, versus personal values and convictions. They're important, they're essential, they're who we are. But sometimes we need to suspend them for a while, develop a beginner's mind, and more systematically understand something. And that is not easy. So sometimes, like concepts in social sciences, the conceptual level of understanding something is sometimes very straightforward, but it's really understanding the complexity of it and the application of it. Like the sociological imagination, it's the, history and biography are connected, right? So a person's own story, their own biography, who they are in terms of a gendered self, as a racialized self, as an individual in terms of their life experiences. It's not only about them, it's about history and culture and society and their social location. It's much more complicated. So that's kind of where we've been. Just like laying out the foundation. This week, we are moving into culture, which is a cool area to kind of examine. And the goal of this lecture video is just kind of walk through the major concepts, and then in class, that we just kind of go back and review and then make applications to different areas. As I mentioned last week, like in the weekly modules, you'll see a document for the video clips. There's a document, or there's an item in the weekly module for the PowerPoint videos, and in the PowerPoint videos also includes a link to, it says something about video links. So there's a document in there with all the videos. The videos are part of, they're important because they're applications, they're ways of understanding things in more detail, but they're also linked to course assessments, quizzes, and things like that. So I can't share these videos with you, like I can't show them right now. That'd be my preferred method, but if I do that and I put this video of this lecture online, then YouTube kind of bans it, says, okay, it's copyrighted material, you can't do that. So anyway, that's the reason for that. So it's really cool, short little video, how the jump rope got its rhythm. Pretty cool, it's kind of looking at culture. I think you could look at the strange and the familiar. I think as you watch that video, think about that particular concept. Think about this sort of example, just kind of a funny one to me. My son and I, years ago, when he was maybe in middle school, we took a trip we were going over to Idaho and then into Montana, and we are going to do some mountain biking. We were coming back. We were in Idaho. It was late at night. We pulled into a Fred Meyer's, and it's probably, I don't know, 10, 11 o'clock at night. There was somebody, a worker, who was cleaning up around the gas, around the gas pumps. And we were waiting in the car, and I was like, man, it's like, how come this attendant isn't coming over and pumping the gas? And, like a few minutes goes on, and like they're just like walking around. I'm like, man, what's going on? And then it's like, oh, we're not in Oregon. You can pump your own gas, or you have to pump your own gas here in Idaho. And it just kind of made me mindful of this funny little moment for me about, oh yeah, different culture, different place. I was kind of in my Oregon culture space, but I was in Idaho, kind of failed to remember, didn't even just didn't think about sort of that place. So let's kind of define terminology. Okay, what is culture? And then kind of explore some different aspects of it. So culture, it consists of the language, and language within a culture, as we'll kind of examine later on. Language and culture are very interactive. So the language system within a culture reflects culture, cultural values and ideas. So the words within a culture are kind of part of a reflection of the cultural values and beliefs and ideals within the culture itself. And then they become mutually influential. So part of culture is part of its language, or part of culture includes its language system, core values and beliefs. So we all have our own individual ones, but we look at it from a cultural viewpoint. There's dominant cultural values and beliefs. Not everybody agrees or believes the same thing, but there's dominant cultural, central core ideas, values, and beliefs that are part of a particular culture. Certain traditions, are an important part of developing culture. Every culture, the stronger the culture, I mean, you can talk about the strength of a culture. Some cultures more salient, strong, and where traditions become a more central role for more people within that particular culture. Certain practices, institutions, the stories that we tell. I mean, all these are different expressions or parts of culture itself. Culture is something that is learned. We don't come out of the womb with an understanding of culture, right? So it's something that we're socialized into. And I would say that for a lot of part of our lives until we get, I don't know, until we really start to probably later adolescence, really start to be thinking more reflectively on our own experience. And then the more, if we have an active mind, an active sociological mind, or an active mind of thinking about people and environment and context, we recognize more and more the way in which culture has shaped us and the way that culture shapes our experience in the world. So to get a culture, one way to do it is to think about the markers for a person that has a successful life living in the United States in any year. So what do we see as being the markers of someone with a successful life? And I think, as a dominant cultural viewpoint, if you think about that for a while, you probably think it's about a lot of material possessions become our markers for somebody who has a successful life. And that's really powerful, right? To step back from that, it's like, somebody to have a successful life, if they're, if we move away and start thinking about what are some other ways that we could mark whether or not a person has a successful life, it could be based on their contributions to their local community, the recognition for their contributions from the local community, the number of people who they're loved by, who they love others and care for others and are part of their network and their group. We can mark success in different ways. People who have a happy life, people who live a content life. But, but we feel this strong sense of a culture about we assign a lot of meaning to material wealth and possession. That's very cultural kind of dimension. Back in week one was this David Foster Wallace, short little excerpts, and they kind of bring it up here again as sort of expression of culture. There's two young fish swimming along. They happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" The two young fish swim for a bit, and then eventually one of them says to the other one, "What the hell is water?" And that's like that cultural, the strange and the familiar kind of thing. Norbert Elias, I think this is kind of interesting, the civilizing process. He wrote about Western European experience, like becoming civilized. Burping, farting, belching, urinating in public, like all these different kind of things. Like take burping, for example, like that's very natural. You have gas, you have just an expression, a body expression, but we assign through culture, we have a lot of different cultural variability about that sort of idea. Like it's just a natural body function, but we've learned this idea that to belch out loud is frowned upon. It's a violation of what we call folkway. It's bad etiquette. And it's this idea of this that becoming, and Norbert Elias isn't saying that we become more civilized, like better than, but it's this idea that we think we become more civilized or culture shaping. But that's just sort of an example of culture. In class, we'll talk about, so what is culture exactly? So we'll kind of review that. We won't do that right here, but some different examples. I was at the Center of Disease Control headquarters in Atlanta a few years ago, and they had an exhibit. One of them was iron lungs. So people with polio back in the 1950s, this is the apparatus as a treatment mechanism, as being in this sort of the iron lung to keep them alive. Part of culture in that time, no longer part of our culture. This is the Green Book. There was a movie based on this. I remember when I was in, I think it was the Johnson President Lyndon Baines Johnson. So his presidential library in Austin, Texas. They had an exhibit about sports and protest. And this is my first introduction to the Green Book, a traveler's guide for Black travelers. Back, I don't even know when the first Green Book was, but I'd say like 1930s, 40s, 50s. We had Jim Crow South, legal segregation between public facilities in the United States. And there's this travel book for safety and security for Black travelers traveling through mostly the South, like where to go there, to places they could find accommodations and these kind of things. I mean, that's part of culture. Like that particular artifact called material culture that we'll talk about is an important part of culture. It helps us understand the past, but also understand the present. Any symbols that we see, this is a symbol, recognizing, celebrating diversity, and all this together kind of thing. And cultural symbols become very important. So culture is around us, yet it's invisible, right? It's part of the taken for granted world. Culture is transmitted from the micro level to the macro level. So from individuals, we all are socialized into culture. It's something that happens throughout our lifespan. And part of our understanding of culture is being shaped by larger macro level forces. Could be history shaping our ways of thinking and knowing. Could be technology, right? Think about the ways in which social media has shaped and influenced communities and people and ourselves, part of culture, but it's technology that's driving that very macro level, outside of ourselves kind of perspective. Culture in some ways functions. This is a very functionalist perspective. Thinking about our application of theory, that culture is important and valuable. It's a way of facilitating connection to community, of creating meaning and understanding, of creating solidarity, of creating a sense of stability, of having some agreed upon values and beliefs and ideals. Part of like thinking about the US, about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, our laws, these are all from a functionalist viewpoint, a part of our consensus of values, that we have agreed upon ideas that are going on. And for a social system to work, you have to have some degree of consensus about what our common core values are. So that's a very functionalist perspective ideal. From a conflict theory perspective, culture reinforces unequal relationships of power. So if you go back to the Green Book, that motorist guide, in some sort of way, from a functionalist viewpoint, the motorist guide arises because the need for, Black people who are traveling, individuals who are Black or traveling throughout the South, or need some sort of manual or order for, for their own travel experience for safety and security. So from a functionalist viewpoint, this arises to take care of a human need. From a conflict theory viewpoint, it's like, well, culture, racial segregation is about racial inequality, that culture and society, the laws and institutions, it was 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, where legal segregation was deemed unconstitutional. And that was in 54, but it took a long time before we moved further and further away from it. Wasn't just because the law was, or the Supreme Court made that decision in 54, didn't mean that institutions immediately became desegregated or that they became non-discriminatory, became different issues of racial inequality within society. So from a conflict theory viewpoint, the perspective is, man, there's culture sometimes, the dominant culture, it's their values that get infused throughout culture and society itself. And the culture is a place that oftentimes reinforces inequality. Now, the reality is that you have functionalism and conflict theory so far. It's not that one's right and one's wrong. there's elements of truth in both, and it's the degrees of truth in both, I think, that are really like, that's the key kind of piece of investigation. Not that we're going to choose one theory and that's going to become the right way. I think if we put all our eggs in one of those baskets, it's going to be faulty. But I think there's an analysis that's important to understand, okay, well, what areas is culture functional and what areas is culture representative, interest, kind of conflict theory kind of idea. Culture is a process and does change. And, culture moves. Sometimes we don't realize that. Kind of like that strange and familiar idea. It seems like it's stationary to us, but it's constantly moving, sometimes more rapidly than others. Sometimes it doesn't move as fast as we want it to in terms of social change. One way to think about culture is like then the individual, the micro and the level, and the macro. So we think about the micro level. Then we think about institutions and structures, and we think about culture. And culture is influencing our institutions. Institutions and culture influence us. We influence institutions and cultures. So it's this very dynamic kind of way of viewing things. So one way, I don't know, a fun way to get at culture is thinking about animal sounds like woof woof, for a dog, or hee haw, like for a donkey. Like, well, is that, like, how do other cultures do that? I think I don't know. It's kind of a really fascinating kind of thing to kind of investigate. One thing started looking into, I didn't put it here, but looking at, and it's interesting because I think it gets at culture in a very unique way, is our voices, our tonal quality of our voices, whether the degree of the bass of our voice versus the range that we have, males and females. So how much of that is driven by biology and how much of it is being shaped by culture? I'm interested in both, for sure, and be able to understand, to what degree is it social cultural. You have to understand the anatomical or biological. There's a lot of part of the human voice that's socially and culturally driven. A deep voice, a very masculine voice, like that is not anatomically. It's not only a product of anatomy. Male voices are lower in tonal quality, but compared to females on average, that's being shaped by, part of that's biological, but part of that what's going on, if you look at nations around the world, it's also being driven by cultural factors. Women's voices around the world are actually lowering in tone. And part of this is because as women are entering into executive positions, moving further and further in leadership positions of power and authority, they're embodying a lower tone voice because that's how they establish, their position, their authority. That's how they communicate their authority. It's how we recognize this through a lower tone voice. So culture is fascinating. Like, that example to me is a really interesting one, because we take it for granted that it's only driven by anatomical kind of things, that it's driven by biology only, but its reality is that it's culture stuff that's going on, it's operating in there. So here's some fun examples. You can look at cat and dog sounds, 70 different countries. What's the sounds that people make? Think about gestures, like how to hail for a taxi or a ride. Different cultures do it in different ways. Everything's okay, A-okay. Ooh, that's not good in certain countries. That's actually, I did that one time. I was in Brazil visiting a friend, and we had dinner, and after dinner they said, "Hey, how's your food?" And I said, "Oh, it was okay. I didn't go like this," which is I usually do, is like this, and then I went like that, and they just started laughing. I said, "What's so funny?" And they said, "Well, you just called us an asshole." And I was like, "Oh no, I meant the food was really good. It was okay." So that gestures, right? Part of culture. Our handshake, how we embrace each other. Like go make a telephone call, like we don't even do that anymore. That's like, it's like these things are part of culture. Short little video. This is kind of interesting one, just about gestures and thinking about gestures. This is 1968 Olympic Games, 2 track and field athletes from the United States who take the stand, winning gold and silver. It's a time period of racial struggle in the United States. This is a symbol of Black power. That symbol, very powerful. They actually had their medals stripped from them. The Olympic Committee felt that they were using the platform for political expression, and they removed the medals from them. This is an Australian athlete as well, and he was also supportive of the two athletes who were standing in solidarity for racial equality. And then here's the United States. This is a picture of a schoolroom in the United States. Of course, we associate that with Germany and with Hitler. This is called the Bellamy salute, Bellamy, which was common in American schoolhouses until World War II, until the rise of Hitler and fascism in Europe. And so that gesture, gestures don't mean anything unless you put them in a culture and give, you can put them in that perspective. It's through culture that we assign meaning to them. The history of the high five, really interesting. So check out that video. And I think it's Village People video is kind of interesting. When you see Village People 1970s, and it's the Village People, the song YMCA. It's still part of culture, right? A lot of celebrations, weddings, YMCA, people dance to it. It's YMCA. This is the Village People representation of the gay community as artists, as musicians, and performing for the public. The song YMCA, it's about men going to the YMCA. It's a place for men to meet each other. So I just always found that fascinating, as the song is about kind of like gay solidarity, or a place for men to meet each other, but then it becomes part of like these wedding ceremonies, and it's like interesting kind of like an origin meaning, the meaning coming from the Village People itself, and then how it gets morphed into culture in different ways. So with two different parts of culture that we can think about. We think about material culture, or the objects that circulate within culture. And objects tell a story, right? This is sort of and material culture is fascinating in that way. We kind of pull apart material culture, we can get into an understanding of cultural values, ideals, technology, these different kind of things. This is G.I. Joe, probably 1960s, 1970s. This is, actually probably 50s, 60s. G.I. Joe. And how does G.I. Joe change across times? Like, whoa, man, it's like, look at material culture. If we look at, like trying to understand, like the change in G.I. Joe, that, we've got to now understand, okay, well, what's driving that particular change? What's going on? So we can understand material culture. We can understand things that are going on in society itself. This is believe it or not, I remember these in bathrooms. This is a way to dry your hands. It was a towel that circulated around. And so, you'd wash your hands, dry, pull it down, and it was the same towel. It's like that long of a towel, right? It's just being circulated around, and who knows how often they change that thing. And you look now, you just go like, from a sanitation level, it's like, oh my gosh, it's kind of frightening. Telephones, part of material culture. Fallout shelters in the 1950s, during the Red Scare of the 1950s, people building fallout shelters in their backyard. Like, whoa, that's kind of interesting material culture kind of thing. Wearing wigs for the wealthy class Europeans. I think part of this is due to syphilis and loss of hair from that disease itself, and so covering it up with a wig, but then wig became associated with class. So it's like these kind of expressions of class through material culture. This is a beer cans, then just looking at the different style of the pop top on that's part of material culture. Food, spam as an interesting one. The Band-Aid, and thinking about racial dimensions of the Band-Aid. The world is not just one color, it's like, invisible, right? Part of culture. It's the water that we swim in. Don't think about necessarily like the color of the Band-Aid. And how to think about that, then sort of like, okay, yeah, it's part of material culture, and helps us understand some things. Asia reacts to Johnson & Johnson skin whitening cream. So this idea that, skin whitening cream, that are products that are being sold, part of material culture. The ashtray, which we don't even, see anymore. I just remember ashtrays in different places. Smoking on airplanes was allowed for, when I was a kid growing up, people smoked on airplanes or in the hospitals even. Part of material culture. This is kind of an interesting example. An interesting thing is it's a pretty cool story of during World War, or the Soviet Union, response to Western culture, nothing to do with Western culture, trying to keep it outside of outside the of Russian culture itself. But there were people who were interested in jazz and music and American culture, and they had these sort of ways of recording. And what somebody started doing is they from a hospital, they took these x-rays. We don't even do that anymore, right? Everything's digital. They used to be film development, so looking at x-rays the bones, whatever it may be. If you're in the dentist office, taking x-rays, but the film would be thrown. Okay, people had all these x-rays, and they're fairly decent sized x-rays, and they after they weren't needed anymore by the hospital, they get thrown away. Somebody was picking them up, and they figured out that they could actually record jazz records from the United States. They could record them on these x-ray film, and these became commodities that were sold in a sort of the underground market within Russia. But I think it's a pretty cool story, right? That's the sort of material culture of these x-ray music. It's a story of Russia, it's a story of people, it's a story of technology. It's like that material culture becomes that kind of a thing. I mean, kind of like take another level, looking at straight white teeth and looking at, man, Americans perceive people with straight white teeth as more likely to be successful. 77% of Americans have dental insurance. 2/3 with insurance have private dental insurance. So the impact in terms of like the ability to have straight white teeth, it's not equally available to everyone. Orthodontic treatment, the number of people who have orthodontic treatment, 80% are currently in orthodontics care. Average visit now at the age of 7. Someone with misaligned teeth and those with straight teeth are 38% more likely to be perceived as smart. Those with straight teeth are 38% more likely to be perceived as smart. Americans prefer a nice smile to clear skin and are willing to go to great lengths to get one. So, man, talk about a lot of meaning assigned to something. Very culturally specific and very powerful, right? Very powerful because it's influences our identities, the way that we view kind of self, the way we view others. And becomes a powerful kind of an example. And it's also a constructed example, right? There's industries that are shaping that, industries that are influencing the sort of idea about the importance of the value of straight white teeth. We have technology to help kind of create this sort of environment with things like bright stripes. And there's a huge industry, that estimated spent almost $70 million. I don't know what year that was. This is 2020 when this article came out. On white strips from Colgate Palmolive. And I mean, it's a lot of money being pumped into all these images that are being circulated in culture about straight white teeth and meaning and value. And it's really, like I said, it's really powerful, right? It's a powerful part of culture. We get socialized into culture. These images are circulated in culture. How do we understand them? How do we make sense of them? What are the gendered components, the racial components of this? The strange and the familiar becomes, the beginner's mind becomes something that we can kind of investigate with that. One thing I find interesting too is just here's a great example of material culture. It's a story of technology. It's a story of commodification, globalization, consumerism, is Gatorade. And you go back and you look at, Gatorade, late 1960s when it was first created by University of Florida. Football team, football coach. I think it was the coach, or maybe in the sports medicine staff, University of Florida, create this substance that helped nourish the football players as they're working really hard in terms of practice. 1969. This would be my guess. I don't know that this is the first year that Gatorade as a company is formed, but that'd be my guess why in this image. But it's somewhere in that time period. And these are like the bottles, right? There's one flavor, it's lemon lime. And that goes on for a long time. Like, and here's 1960, 1995. I still remember getting a glass bottle of Gatorade, which was super cool. And then it goes into plastic. like, okay, 2002 plastic. Okay, wow, that's kind of interesting. Think about the material culture, the development of the plastic industry, the application of plastic, very transformative to culture and society, but also very problematic at the same time. Some challenges with that, and then all the different bottle sizes and shapes and forms. It's just crazy to me. If you go to like the aisle, the sports drinks aisle, and you're just like, wow, man, it is so incredibly diverse in terms of, but it's all the same. I mean, they're all sports drinks. You have different companies offering different things. They're different, but it's this expression of the abundance of choices that are available to us as consumers. It's part of culture. It gets infused throughout culture. I remember coaching the kids' soccer team when the kids were young, and and parents bringing Gatorade or Powerade sports drinks to their kids. We're talking like second, third grade, and I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. It's just become part of culture. Like, kids are playing soccer, and it's not like they're getting that huge of a workout where they need like a replenishment of their electrolytes, at the age of, 5, 6, 7 years old. But it's this infusion within culture and society becomes part of our culture, right? I think it's another good example. This is I was just looking at some stuff about clothing throughout the American history. We produced our clothes, so this is kind of a story of globalization. The more we become globalized, 1970s, 1980s, really that the next stage, another stage of globalization. Manufacturing starts to move to different countries. Our clothes gets manufactured somewhere else. So 750,000 jobs in clothing in textile industry, clothing disappeared in this 20-year time period, according to Goodwear website. The average American household spends about $1,800 a year. This is kind of interesting. I found in 1960, actually, families were spending a lot more money relatively on clothing. Clothing has become much cheaper for us, and we buy a lot more of it. I mean, mass consumption. I mean, this is part of our mass consumption model. It's part of our economic engine in a way, is one built on mass consumption. The average household spending on clothing has reached a plateau and is roughly about 1740. Only about 3-4% of our average household goes to clothing. Percentage of clothing manufacturing has continued to decline. It's now about 2%. So the story of clothing, like you go to the store, you buy a shirt. You could ask so many questions about that. Where does it come from? Who's making it? Where did that shirt come from before? All these different kind of dimensions about clothing that can kind of get into. The other aspect of culture is non-material culture. So getting into values, beliefs, and ideals within culture itself. I find this example is a really interesting one of looking at the speeding ticket. So what we identify as being fair is culture. Like the way we think about fairness is part of an expression of culture. And it's invisible to us, it's the water that we swim in. So we view something as being fair from a viewpoint, for example, speeding ticket, which we'll use that a person who gets, two people get pulled over for going 75 in a 50-mile-an-hour speed limit area. Both individuals get their ticket costs the same. For us, that's fair, regardless of the circumstances of the individual. Both individuals going the same speed, the same amount of the speed limit, both get the same fine. In Finland, and this started, I'm not sure if it started in Finland, but it's in a lot of European countries now, is that it's based on your income bracket. So that if you make more, so let's say what person A is, this is just sort of hypothetical, makes $200,000 a year. Person B makes $50,000 a year. Person A, they both go the same amount over the speed limit, but person A, their fine maybe 3 times as much as person B. It's based on and you think about it from one level, right? Beginner's mind, let's just step back out versus just trying to develop either an aversion or an allegiance to this idea. Think about the speeding ticket. The fine is meant to be a deterrent, and it makes more critical from a rational sense. It makes more sense that your speeding ticket, if it's meant to be a deterrent, then it should be shaped by your income level. If you make a lot more money, the same fine is going to be much more of an impact on the individual who makes less money than a person who makes more. If you made a lot of money, I mean, Bill Gates getting a speeding ticket and it's, $500. I mean, there's no deterrent value to that for him. Even if his insurance goes up, it's like, oh, so what? But that idea, I think this is like non-material culture, right? Is that, the United States, and then like Fox News, a more conservative network, made mention that, when there's some discussion going on in the United States about having speeding tickets. And, from that political viewpoint and from our cultural viewpoint, we don't see that as being fair. We'd see that as like it's punishing people for being wealthy kind of thing, or it's unfair that people have to pay more just because they make more. It's like, and people get really strong convictions and beliefs about that. And it's expression of culture. I mean, it's not like it's the right way, that there's one right. There's different ways that are doing things that are being shaped by culture in different ways. I mean, that's, I think, an important part to recognize. I was in Cuba years ago, and it's kind of interesting. We were, one part of our stay was down in Havana. And I remember coming back, we rented a car, went traveling around, and me and my buddy of mine, and we were coming back into Havana. We came through like there's a district here. Maybe it's out here a little bit further. It's kind of a resort called the Veradero District. And we're coming along the highway. Most people don't have cars, transportation. And there was just people on the side of the highway, and we were just cruising, coming. We're about maybe, I don't know, let's say 20 miles from downtown Havana. And there's like almost like I'm not gonna say, it was an area where there was some inspectors going on. So people were coming into the city. And there was people on the side of the highway, and we started slowing down. And then, maybe we were going a couple miles an hour. Well, then somebody came up to the car, opened up the door, and she just got in. And we're like, oh, hey, what's going on? What's happening? Can I help you? I, just started speaking Spanish the way that I can, my minimal Spanish, started chatting with her, and she needed a ride to the hospital. She just got in the car. She just needed a ride, and it's like, oh, so we gave her a ride, gave her a ride to Havana and gave her a ride to the hospital. She was going to see her daughter, I believe, who was in the hospital. But I was just thinking, it's like a little bit of a culture shock thing, it's like for me, like that would just never happen here. And I understandably, it was a different culture, different place. But that's part of, non-material culture, just the way practices, beliefs, the way people do and do things. Okay, let's go talk about ideal culture, practice culture. So ideal culture is like the way we want it to be. It's like our aspirational culture. And then there's the practice culture, the real culture, the culture of it that actually operates. So the real culture, I think, is what the authors of the textbook talk about as the real culture. So our ideal culture is that everybody's treated equally, regardless of the color of their skin or gender or other dimensions of their identity. The reality is that the practice culture, the real culture, can be something that's different. If you look at this, just a quick chart of looking at income development since 1970. The income top 90 of the top 10%. Their revenue, their income has increased pretty significantly. The bottom 10% is maintained. It's been relatively stagnant. So growing inequality. We have an ideal culture that, that we're all sharing this kind of experience together, this sort of story that we tell, but the reality, it could be something different. This is sort of an image about, like go back to fairness, right? This idea that everybody has the same box they can stand on. They're watching a baseball game and there's a fence here. It's like, well, is that really kind of fair? What's our culture say about sort of distribution of resources to help ensure everybody can see the game or participate in the game? This seems to be another sort of, this becomes a little bit more, this is like equality. Everybody gets the same. This is equity, that resources are there. Different people get different levels of resources based on need. So the shorter person gets more. Now they're both the same height. They all can see the game. And this one I think is transformative. It's like, well, why even have a fence anyway? Shouldn't everybody, universal design, everybody get to be able to play. So ideal culture, practice culture. Ideal culture, democracy. Everybody has a right to vote. But then we get practice culture. We go all the way for women's the exclusion of women from voting until early 1900s. Women established the right to vote. 1924, finally Native Americans get the right to vote. We talk about voting rights today, like an exclusion of African Americans, Black people from voting, people of color from voting historically, different literacy tests, poll taxes, things that went on historically to prevent restricting the access of voting for people of color within the United States. We still have that issue today. There's a lot of discussion about, you can talk about voter ID laws, voter restrictions, all these different kind of things. There's a lot of political tension going on around that. I think there's a strong case to be made that there's a lot going on that's disenfranchising or suppressing the voting of particular demographics of people from voting. So we have our ideal culture that everybody should have the right to vote, that we encourage people to vote, but then we have the practice culture, the reality. We have the ideal culture around, let's say, maternity, that we are a culture that values family and supports family, supports families, supports women and men and their experience in terms of family and the development of a family. We're the only country, but the practice culture, the real culture, we're the only industrialized country that does not have required paid maternity leave. For women in the United States, who have a child, if they're fully employed, they access their short-term disability, which is such a strange thing to me. Access short-term disability in order to obtain the resources. Plus, I guess there's sick leave, vacation days, and things like that. Ideal culture, practice culture. Thinking about minimum wage. What are wages worth? Another aspect of that. Think about the Barbie, the ideal culture, and ideal culture is changing, right? The representation of female body, and an increased recognition of some of the problems of some of those previous forms of representation, both from problems in terms of just the range of body representations, the body sizes, shapes, forms, as well as racial representations as well. So even the language, we talk about body positivity. There's another word, I can't think of the other word, but thinking about another part of our culture of recognizing, moving away from this sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s sort of idea of the thin female white body as being the cultural ideal, and changing that cultural ideal. Male body, kind of same thing. This is, this idea of the meaning that we assign to being skinny, to being this, like, the six pack being ripped out. Ideal culture versus, well, how are people really, right? Kind of thing. Again, going back to this is water, David Foster Wallace, we can be swimming in culture, but unless we step back and sort of understand it, it's like we don't even recognize that we're in it, right? So we live in this sort of, the way that we tell stories about the idealized culture, we could get socialized into that without even really thinking about the practice side of things. This is a great book. I found it interesting. Kurt Anderson talked about Fantasyland, how America went haywire, 500-year history. So he goes back to colonial America, tracing the roots of Fantasyland. Americans have really believed in this sort of idea of, and it's so important, a central part of our culture, this idea that we are unrestrained. We can kind of be whoever we want to be. We are this sort of place of the shining the beacon on the hill, and that's aspirational and very valuable, and for sure. I mean, every culture has an idealized culture. Every culture has a practice culture. So the aspirational culture is very beneficial. It moves us in very powerful ways. But if we don't pay attention to the practice culture, then we're just living in we're in this fantasy land. And we are having a difficult time recognizing the reality land. And if we want to get better, closer to that idealized culture, we have to understand practice culture to help us move closer to that place of who we really kind of want to be, kind of thing. So the importance of understanding the idealized culture and practice culture is they all have them, all cultures have them, but it's the degree of separation between the idealized and the practice. The more we understand the difference, the more we are empowered to take steps to get closer to that idealized form. And all theories have their analysis to that. So the functionalist perspective would be that I mean, our idealized culture, these are cultural values that help center us, help us create a sense of common identity, experience, aspiration, very beneficial in that regard. Conflict theories would say that our idealized culture can be very beneficial, but it's also an expression, it prevents us from dealing with inequalities, right? So we have this idea of the idealized culture. Anybody can be whoever they want to be. That idea, if we're so rigidly holding on to that, then we're neglecting the reality in terms of people's experiences of how, structured inequality exists within society itself, prevents us from going into examining that and trying to understand that and pull that apart. And then the interactionist perspective is the meaning that we assign the world, things within our social and cultural world. So it's like, how do we assign meaning? How do we understand things, the stories that we tell? How do we kind of go there? Okay, so we've got, we'll try to finish up in about 10 minutes here. Cruise a little bit faster, maybe 15 minutes. So subcultures, countercultures, subcultures are cultures that exist within society itself. They may have different values, beliefs, and ideas different from mainstream culture, but they're not actively involving to try to change culture or in direct opposition to it, just kind of existing differently. So sneakerheads, people who are they collect sneakers. People are into costume play, cosplay, subculture. Counterculture are those who are in opposition to mainstream dominant culture, oftentimes trying to change it. The purpose of subcultures and countercultures is meaning, belonging, and connection. And for countercultures, for either social change or to it could be that added dimension to that. But it's a lot of that meaning, belonging, and connection that's going on in either case. Sometimes it's very difficult, like white supremacy, white nationalism, white nationalist groups. That's a very subculture. There's a countercultural dimension there, but it's much more of a subcultural kind of component. Because I put here, sometimes it's not easy to categorize as one or the other, but it's trying to understand that distinction. Subcultures exist. They exist for meaning, belonging, and connection. Countercultures do the same. Countercultures are an expression of something going wrong within society or people standing up saying, hey, there's something that we want to see done differently. So countercultures develop within society itself. Hegemony, an important concept, is this idea that the general population agrees to their own domination, the domination by the ruling class. So we believe this story, for example, that if you just work hard, you can be whoever you want to be. That's very hegemonic. It's a dominant cultural value and belief. There's some truth to that, self-determination, right? There is some truth to that, but there's more complicated than that. Not everybody has the same resources available to them. But if we believe this idea that if you just work hard enough, you can be whoever you want to be, that benefits the ruling class. And that's sort of the benefits, because it doesn't say anything about a person's resources that are available to them that may provide them opportunities to get where they want to be. People have a lot of resources, they make it. We feel it's like, well, because they earned it, right? It's like, well, in part, right? Self-determined, but there's a more complicated story. Okay, cultural hegemony. Antonio Gramsci came up with this concept, the idea that dominant ideology, the beliefs and values reflect that of the ruling class. The dominant values and beliefs in society are those that represent the ruling class. Dominant ideologies justify the existing relationships within society, and those relationships benefit the ruling class. It becomes part of our culture. We get attached to it. We have a hard time seeing it. We don't take a beginner's mind, and we just kind of accept this would be like, things that are very hegemonic. We are, in the United States, we are very oppositional to unions. France has the lowest, but I put a little note there, is that because in France, every worker has representation. They have less of a need for union because the workers and labor have bargaining influence at the table. So unions are groups to represent workers. And in the United States, we have really low union membership rates. I mean, why do we have that? It's because we have a cultural, that from a hegemonic viewpoint, we have a cultural value belief that private industry has more, shouldn't be constrained by the influence of labor in that way. This is like, who benefits from that? This idea would be that the ruling class benefits from that viewpoint. And there's a lot of evidence that as union membership declines, so does inequality kind of goes up. So there's like, I'm trying to make sense of this. Another part of culture is cultural appropriation and appreciation. So we'll talk more about this in class. Appropriation is taking something from another group's culture and using it for monetary gain development or political gain development in some way. Degree of knowledge and engagement of history and culture between the dominant group and the subordinate group. Degree of respect. So things that are more about appreciation is respecting that cultural item, respecting the history and the history of it, its place within that other culture. I mean, economic gain, I think part of appropriation is about economic gain. It's about not paying attention to and valuing and respecting the culture from where that comes from. So from a functionalist viewpoint, what was part of culture, like Aunt Jemima as this image and this idea, this is part of our cultural values, part of a consensus of values. From a conflict theory viewpoint is that these things are about dominant cultural values, that what's going on within culture sometimes denies, distorts, or dehumanizes other groups for economic gain and development. So it's not about one thing, though. So we think about the Washington Redskins, where I go, okay, well, Winnebago, it's Native American tribal name, and now it's a part of a commodity. It's being appropriated, put it on it's a commodity. Sundance Film Festival taking this ritual from a native culture and put it in terms like this sort of Sundance Film Festival, the Washington Redskins. It's not about the one thing, right? We can get wrapped up in definitely, it is about the one thing in one way, but it's about a smorgasbord. It's about a collective. It's about a pattern more than it is about the one thing alone. So sometimes when people bring up the Winnebago, you got to be kidding me, man. It's a Winnebago. It's just like the name. It's just one of many different examples, right? So let's look at the larger kind of landscape picture and think about appropriation in a much more complex way that seems to be more systematic or more detailed or more in depth. This is interesting, like Land O'Lakes, kind of they've removed now, used to be this Native American as part of their marketing campaign. This is all appropriation kind of stuff going on. Indian motorcycles, patterns in terms of the Navajo hipster underwear panty, appropriation. More difficult to recognize and objectively evaluate things that are in our present. So we start to look at things that we are, the water that we're immediately in versus water from the past. We have a harder time seeing what's going on now. One product or practice is not the analysis. It's more, let's look at more broadly. There's subjectivity in terms of determining that, like who determines and how do we determine what's appropriation. I think if we define it, then we have a better way of understanding what's appropriation and what is not. Products and practices are just not just there. They come from somewhere. This becomes part of culture. So blackface, minstrels, white people dressed in blackface, black people dressing in blackface during Jim Crow South. That part wasn't just there. That comes out of a particular social arrangement, a cultural time period, a cultural place. Okay, so let's talk about one aspect of culture. It's language. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir-Whorf, Edward Sapir, Benjamin Whorf had this idea that language and thought are interactive. The language that we have influences our thought. We view the world through a lens of language. So language and culture are interactive. So to what extent becomes the question, and there's this sort of, I read parts of this book, McWhorter's book, who provides a perspective that language doesn't have as much influence as we think, but then you have another camp that, it's like language has this powerful influence in how we view the world. Language and culture are interactive. There's this interesting video, I think a very beneficial one, about why the idea of freedom fries. So after 9/11, the Twin Towers, the attack on the Twin Towers, and there was a little discussion for the French government was not as involved as we wanted them to be in terms of fighting, terrorism. And there's again saying we should protest and no longer call for French fries. French fries, let's call them freedom fries. And there's this kind of interesting video about why that doesn't work. So language and culture interactive. Whorf used this idea about the Hopi Indians and time and Eskimos and snow, the physical descriptions of the world, words that we have are ways of describing the world. They shape the way we view the world. There's some problems with this. We'll kind of talk about this in class a little bit more. but the idea of superior wharf is that language structures thought. So think about people, individuals who speak multiple languages. One possibility is that you have two different, if you speak two different languages, you actually have two different minds. Another possibility is you still have one way, you have two different language systems, but you really have one mind. You just have a much more elaborate language system. Third reality is it's somewhere in between the two. I think one way you could look at this is looking at gender, the language that we view things. And there's a cool research study of looking at like the word for a bridge, el puente in Spanish, the bridge. Another country could be la, like a feminine pronoun. So gendered pronouns associated with things, and how that gendered pronouns influence how people describe that particular physical object, the physical world. So in countries where the object is where it's just the pronoun is a masculine pronoun, tend to describe the bridge in more physical terms like strength, appearance in that regard. For feminine pronouns, elegance and beauty. It's really interesting kind of stuff about how language structures thought. Another example of this is Boroditsky's work, country that doesn't have words for left or right, but they use cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, and how language structures thought is sort of another example of that. And I'll talk about that in class, hopefully a little bit as well. Other examples, looking at language and culture, thinking about this idea of praxis. We try to study something in order to change it. Like, why study it if we're not interested in actually doing something with it? So the idea of praxis is to study to change something. Think about linguistic sexism, language, and how language sometimes reinforces ideas of gender inequality. So gender inclusive language, so fireman, policeman, to police officer, to firefighter, is about gender inclusive language. And it's more than just about changing words, right? It's about representing a change in culture, representing a change in the way we think about things, the way we approach the world. So language is really powerful that way, in that regard. A person is not crippled. A person is a person with a particular disability. The word colored people is a callback to the 1950s and before. And today and so that language of racial inequality of colored people, it's going back to that time period. It gets confusing because I think some students, some individuals still use that language, but they don't mean to use that. When sometimes students in a paper write colored people, because they don't understand that distinction between colored people and people of color. People of color, more contemporary way of thinking about universally, individuals who are not part of the majority group, and as a representative of people of color. Colored people is just sort of going back to the 1950s and that time period. The idea of like Latinx, Hispanic, Latina, Chicana, Chicano, like that language, things are going on in culture, changing. Cisgender, gender fluidity, transgender, language is changing, representing culture. I was playing golf one day with my brother-in-law a long time ago, walked through a neighborhood playing golf, and I saw this house, and I go, man, that person must have a great job. And then I thought about it a little bit later, and I thought, why did I say this person has a great job? Is this person has a high-paying job? That could even still be an assumption. Maybe they inherited money, I don't know. But I use the word great job. And I go, wow, man, that's pretty powerful. Culture is into the way that we think, right? Is in the way I thought about things. Changing language, changing our in some ways, changing our thoughts, even at emotional level. There's a branch of psychotherapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, of being aware of our thoughts. Like sometimes if we develop self-defeating thoughts, oh, I can't do this, I never can do this. This sort of always, never kind of thinking is very problematic for our own self-development. Our own mental health is impacted by that. Okay, I'm going to talk about lastly about ideas of movement of culture. Cultural diffusion is something moving, being diffused throughout cultures. Leveling, things become more similar. Imperialism is that the dominant culture is dominating other cultures as well. So there's examples of cultural diffusion. One example is the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South in 1915, World War I time period, World War II, another time period of the movement of African Americans out of the South. When they left out of the South, they brought with them their culture. So diffusion of like the blues, I mean, you have Chicago blues, you have St. Louis blues, you have different style of blues going on in different communities, Kansas City blues. That's about diffusion. People are moving, they're traveling, they're bringing with them their culture, and it's becoming part of culture in different places. So it's getting diffusion. Let me kind of go here. This is like cultural leveling. Things become more similar. So Starbucks, more and more places around the world. Costco, more and more places around the world. We went to family vacation in Maui years ago with my brother and sister and families. Get off the plane, and my brother goes, "Huh, we could be in anywhere USA. There's a Sam's Club, there's a Costco, there's Starbucks. You know, it's like it's all strip malls, at least in that one area." So it's like that's cultural leveling. Things become more and more the same. If you look at things like, music is really interesting, cultural diffusion, punk music, early hip hop music, rap and hip hop. This is like subculture, mass culture. Now it's like in clothes and, it's like it's mass commodification. It's being appropriated. So it's like punk music and even like rap and hip hop gets appropriated from its original form, gets mass commodified for economic interests. This is not true of all hip hop. There's still hip hop culture, but there's been this sort of mass commodification. And then there's that's like this appropriation. And then there's this, diffusion is the movement, leveling more the same. And then imperialism is domination of the dominant group, sort of taking over or dominating other cultures, changing other nations and their culture. So, for example, bringing the Super Bowl to Central America. This is sort of like a project with the NFL. It's like trying to extend the influence of the NFL in different places. So this is a book sort of about the athletic crusade, sport and American cultural imperialism, like trying to dominate more and more markets. So that's cultural imperialism sort of idea. All right, so that's the content for Culture. Look forward to our discussion in class. Have a great rest of your day and keep me posted if you have any questions, and see you sometime soon.